Welcome back to our channel. Today, we will take an amazing expedition through the life and legacy of one of history's greatest philosophers, Confucius. More than 2,500 years ago, during China's turbulent spring and autumn period, Confucius was more than a teacher and thinker. He was a visionary whose ideas set the moral and political foundations for East Asia for centuries. In this video, his early life, his rise as a philosopher and educator, his teachings, and how that legacy has affected millions of people around the world are discussed. Whether you are interested in philosophy or history, or just want to know about a person her wisdom sings to, then this detailed 4-chapter story of Confucius is what you need. So settle down comfortably. This is a wonderful story waiting to unfold about the fascinating world of Confucius. Confucius, in the Chinese parlance, Kongqiu or Confuzi, was born in 551 BCE in Lu, a small kingdom situated in present-day Shandong province in China. His birth occurred during the turbulent era known as the Spring and Autumn period, around 771 to 476 BCE. When regional political fragmentation was rife, states frequently waged war against each other, and social unrest was rampant. The realm of China, which had for centuries been under the rule of the Zhou dynasty, was now seeing the gradual erosion of its sovereignty. And the feudal lords of the states were increasingly asserting their own brand of independence. Into this chaotic, ever-shifting world was born Confucius, destined to become one of the most prominent philosophers and teachers in Chinese and, indeed, world history. Confucius was of noble origin, tracing back to the days of the Zhou. The Kong family was regarded as aristocracy, although around the time of Confucius's birth, his family had suffered much during the intervening years and had lost much of its wealth and political power. His father, Kong He, was a military officer of low rank, while his mother, Yan Zhengzai, was a devoted woman who greatly shaped his early character. By the time he was quite young, perhaps as young as 3 years old by some accounts, Confucius was tragically made an orphan by his father's death. Loss of earnings made for an adverse economic backdrop to life. Growing up in poverty, Confucius, as a small child, was nurtured by his mother with discipline and responsibility for moral acts. Despite all the hardships, however, Confucius was gifted from the onset with an extraordinary intellect and an insatiable curiosity. Confucius did not follow the other aristocratic children to either private or formal schooling, as was the custom of most noble children at the time. He was self-taught, studying ancient texts and occult rites, music, poetry, and history. For much of his life, Confucius was regarded as one who cherished learning and education and was committed to self-improvement. By his teens, Confucius was noted for his serious study and moral perspective. In his early years, he had an ardent interest in the traditional culture of those of the Zhou dynasty, the rituals, music, and moral teachings upon which social order was built in ancient China. For Confucius, these traditions were not mere cultural relics, but the very instrument that could restore harmony in a world past its moral prime. It is necessary to understand the surroundings of Confucius to make a close study of Confucius's early development. The Spring and Autumn period was named after the historical chronicle Spring and Autumn Annals, which recorded events of the state of Lu during this period. China was a land divided into dozens of competing states ruled by feudal lords, with alliances that kept on shifting and frequent wars. The Zhou king still existed as a nominal overlord, but real power was fragmented. This period saw the decline of the traditional feudal order and the rise of philosophies trying to contend with the problems of governance, ethics, and social harmony. Confucius experienced these tumultuous events, during which he watched the decline in moral consciousness, the rise of selfishness and corruption among rulers, and the suffering of the populace. These events deeply cemented the basis of his later teachings. Though impoverished, Confucius was determined to serve the state and society by way of public office. He spent his early years in several minor government posts in Lu, accumulating experience in the field of administration and governance. He has been portrayed in history as an honest and conscientious official, interested in justice and reform. While his first officially recorded job was that of keeper of the granary, in which he oversaw the storage and distribution of food supplies, he was later entrusted with far weightier positions of justice minister and director of rituals. In this way, Confucius gained practical experience in government and the problem of leadership. He considered the political climate frustrating. In Lu and subsequently in other states, the rulers often paid no heed or were actually hostile to his entreaties for moral governance and social reform. His ideals were entirely in conflict with the realpolitik of the time, which involved power struggles, bribery, and favoritism. During his government career, he began his teachings and the formation of his philosophical system. He assembled a small circle of disciples from divergent social backgrounds, a revolutionary step in itself, since education had until then been reserved for the noble. Confucius had a few working experiences in public service and education before setting out on a journey that would indeed shape his own life and Chinese civilization. The chapter centers upon the evolution of Confucius's philosophical teachings, the development of his own form of education, the various states he traveled through, and the many trials he faced trying to institute moral governance and social harmony. Having discovered his real vocation as a teacher rather than a mere government officer, he started devoting more time toward education after he turned about 30 years old and had spent several years working in minor governmental positions. He opened up his school to all students, regardless of social class, an act that had never been witnessed before in ancient China, where education had customarily been the privilege of the nobility and aristocrats. A diverse body of disciples began appearing at his school and included nobles and minor officials, as well as commoners, who came to learn not only about ritual, history, and poetry, but also ethics, leadership, and self-cultivation. Confucius taught that all men must make efforts toward the betterment of themselves, and that the improvement of one's moral character is of far greater significance than birthright. Unlike any other school, Confucius was marked by inclusiveness, and this formed the basis for a new intellectual tradition known as Confucianism. It was between 500 BC and 475 BC that Confucius set forth the fundamental doctrines defining his philosophy, among which the foremost are: Ren is somewhat ambiguously translated as benevolence, humaneness, or kindness, an ideal attitude emphasizing empathy and kindness toward others. Confucius thought Ren ought to be the foundation of all moral behavior and social harmony. Li refers simply to acts of worship and ritual ceremonies. Also, talismans and good manners uphold respect for society. Confucius stated that observing Li was necessary for the individual to produce virtue and for society to keep running smoothly. Yi means righteousness. Emphasis is laid upon performing what is morally right, even when doing so infringes on personal interests. For Confucius, Yi meant integrity and having the courage to uphold one's principles. Considered wisdom, whereby one knows what is right and wrong and is able to consider what is best. Xiao, filial piety, respect and allegiance towards one's parents and grandparents. Central to the Confucian way of social relations, deemed by Confucius as the foundation of a harmonious family, which supported a stable society. Confucius believed that all of these virtues interacted with one another, and that the practice of these virtues would produce men of moral virtue, capable of leadership. Confucius did not write down his teachings, but the disciples of Confucius compiled many of his conversations and ideas into a text later called the Analects, Lunyu. These sayings, conversations, and ideas formed the basic scriptures of Confucianism. The Analects reveal that Confucius's method of teaching is mostly one of asking questions, telling stories, and having discussions, rather than lecturing directly. He did not want his students to accept everything passively, but saw critical reflection as the only valid path toward learning. Thus, true learning comes from within as reinforced by practical experience. Confucius was not content to teach alone. He tried to put his ethics into political practice. In his 50s, Confucius was able to attain high office in his home state of Lu. One of his offices was Minister of Crime, or Justice, where he tried to implement reforms inspired by his concepts of moral governance and fairness. During his tenure, Confucius applied efforts against corruption, for merit-based appointments, and for rulers to lead by moral example. He taught that rulers should govern by virtue instead of by punishment or force. Therefore, if the ruler was virtuous, the people would follow. Yet, Confucius's reforms did not sit well with certain entrenched interests and his political rivals. The power clashes in Lu were bitter, and his stress on ethical leadership threatened many officials. Soon, after a couple of years, he was made to resign. Upon leaving official service, Confucius spent some 14 years traveling to various states, Qi, Wei, Song, and Chen, seeking rulers willing to entertain his ideas of virtuous government. During these travels, he gathered disciples and continued teaching, hoping to influence political leaders. The travels were not easygoing. More often than not, Confucius found the local rulers either skeptical or hostile, or just indifferent to his message. They were more interested in power than in morality. Yet he was persistent, a sign of his dedication to his vision. In some states, he got his message heard better than in others. However, none possessed the political might to implement a wide-going reform. These years were times of frustrating yet constructive intellectual development for his followers, as Confucius himself honed his teachings and strategies. Confucius had a very revolutionary view of education in his world context. Contrary to the elitist system that had predominated his time, he saw the need for opening education to all willing to learn. In this regard, he set the example himself, emphasizing certain virtues, humility among them, respect, and discipline. His teaching methods consisted of dialogue and questioning, encouraging students to think critically and examine their own beliefs. recitation of classical texts, to connect students with ancient wisdom and cultural traditions. Moral cultivation, helping students develop character and ethical understanding. Practical application, stressing the importance of putting knowledge into practice, especially in governance and social conduct. Such an ambience of teaching helped establish an atmosphere of mutual respect between teacher and student, and inspired a lasting tradition of scholarship. Over time, Confucius amassed dozens of disciples who respected him deeply for his wisdom and moral integrity. From these closest disciples came some famous names, including Yan Hui, Zilu, Zhengzi, and many others who would become prominent teachers and transmitters of Confucianism. Having disciples from diverse backgrounds showed Confucius's desire for inclusiveness. Many of these students demolished Confucius's teachings and extended them long after his death. Even though he garnered respect from many disciples, Confucius's thought was not accepted universally during his own lifetime. His insistence on social ritual and hierarchy was in contrast with other emerging philosophies, including Taoism and legalism, which were presenting different answers to the social disorder of the times. Moreover, Confucius found his idealism often running into the hard realities of a power struggle in the political arena. His insistence on virtue and morality would sometimes be taken as being naive or impractical in the rough-and-tumble world of feudal states. He had many personal tragedies, too. Some records stated that he was misunderstood, mocked, or even persecuted for his beliefs. Nevertheless, notwithstanding these obstacles, the second phase of Confucius's life proved essential to laying the foundations of Confucianism both intellectually and institutionally. It firmly established Confucius as a teacher and philosopher, making his ideas gain some traction. Many that had been attracted to Confucius and his values, those of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and filial piety, and provided a renewed hope for renewing harmony to a fragmented society. By the culmination of this phase of Confucius's life, he was past the identity of just a government official or itinerant scholar. He was turning into a cultural icon whose philosophy would usher in an era of Chinese thought for thousands of years. The latter part of Confucius's life saw the climbing of the reputation of his teaching and moral philosophy, while his political ambitions largely remained unachieved. This chapter explores the final years of Confucius, keeping up with the labors of teaching and training his disciples, preserving their teachings, and the immediate legacy that was left at the time of his death. Around the age of 68, after traveling for about 14 years from one state to another, Confucius once again arrived at his home state, Lu. The journey had been a long search for political support for his ideal of virtuous governance, but none of the rulers whom he met were willing or able to bring his reforms into execution. Confucius arrived back in Lu without recovering any official post, but found a slightly more receptive atmosphere for teaching and moral influence. The state itself needed social and political stability. Thus, they welcomed the presence of this revered elder and teacher. Confucius's activities in Lu were centered on teaching and training his disciples, with an emphasis on moral development, right conduct, and the study of ancient texts. As his school grew in prominence, his disciples undertook the hard task of faithfully transmitting his ideas and teachings. From the very foundation of his educational philosophy, stood a teacher-disciple relationship. It was through this medium that Confucius believed knowledge and ethical values should flow from master to student to nurture the gradual transformation of society from the ground. Many of Confucius's disciples enjoyed high government and education posts and practiced spreading his teachings beyond the state of Lu. Although Confucius himself never personally wrote down any of the several hundred books that would eventually develop into Confucianism, he was extremely active in the compilation, editing, and interpretation of the 5 classics, ancient Chinese texts that would become the foundation of Chinese culture and education. These are the Book of Changes, Yi Jing, a book on divination and philosophy; the Book of Poetry, Shi Jing, a collection of ancient poems and songs; the Book of History, Shu Jing, historical documents and speeches recorded; the Book of Rites, Li Ji, texts dealing with social rituals and etiquette; the Spring and Autumn Annals, Chun Qiu, a history of the state of Lu. Confucius further contributed to the preservation and systematization of these works so as to transmit the moral and cultural traditions of ancient China to later generations. Much of what is known about him comes from the Analects, which are treatments of the sayings and discussions of Confucius as related by his contemporaries and disciples. Though compiled well after his death, they give us a vivid picture of his ideas, methods of teaching, and personality. Confucius' scholar emphasis on making ethics practical, on self-cultivation, and on leading by example runs through the entire text. The Analects became among the most studied texts available to Chinese education and remain the preeminent reference work to understand Confucian thought. At the core of Confucius's idea is that a just and harmonious society depended on the virtue of its rulers and citizens. Political power should be exerted, he taught, through moral authority, not through coercion. He professed the ideal of the junzi, often translated as gentleman, one who embodies virtue, wisdom, and benevolence, standing as an example for the whole of society, both for leaders and common people. For Confucius, getting one's own person to embody virtue and observing social rituals would cure the disorder of a world riven by conflict and declining in morals. As historical examples suggest, Confucius is portrayed as a man of the deepest humility, patience, and compassion. He respected traditional norms, but was not afraid to question and innovate. Through all political setbacks and social rejection, he remained true to his calling for learning and educating others. His thought rejected fatalism. In other words, Confucius stressed that humans, through improving themselves and making the world a better place, were responsible for the course of their lives. So, in a nutshell, the very essence of his philosophy was continuous self-cultivation. Confucius died in 479 BCE at the age of 72. Neither fame nor immediate acceptance brought his ideas to the world at the time. Meanwhile, political turmoil existed in China. Both Taoism and legalism were competing for power. In any case, the disciples of Confucius, joined by their descendants, kept the teachings alive by teaching and practicing the values that Confucius stood for. Confucius was buried in Khufu, in Shandong province. Years later, his starting point became a site for worship, with temples and memorials built below his name. The Confucius Temple at Khufu is counted among the greatest and most prominent cultural heritage sites in China. Some titles granted posthumously, since Confucius's time reaffirm his eminent role in shaping Chinese culture and philosophy. Confucius's influence did not end with his death in 479 BC, but rather grew exponentially over the centuries to influence Chinese civilization and the cultural and political framework of East Asia. This chapter deals with the post-lifetime development of Confucianism, its changes in society, government, and education, and its relevance in the modern world. After the death of Confucius, his disciples and followers were determined to preserve and propagate the teachings of Confucius, amid vigorous competition from other schools of philosophy such as Taoism, legalism, and Mohism. During the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, however, Confucianism was made the official state doctrine. With Han emperors embarking on the project of using Confucian thought as a basis for government administration, social order, and education. This gave Confucianism unparalleled influence on Chinese politics and culture for over 2 millennia. Thus, Confucian ideals such as filial piety, loyalty, justice, and respect for hierarchy became ingrained in society. One of the critical ways Confucianism entered Chinese life was through the introduction of the imperial examination system. Established by the Sui and Tang dynasties, it required prospective government officials to select from Confucian classics for meritocratic exams. The imperial exams promoted the ideals of literacy, scholarship, and social mobility based on merit. Candidates had to have knowledge of Confucian texts and proper moral conduct, rather than being privileged by noble birth. Thus, the exam system helped to institutionalize Confucian values within the bureaucracy and educated classes. The influence of Confucianism, however, was strong enough to go far beyond Chinese borders. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam thus took up Confucian teachings as integral to their own cultures and political structures. In Korea, Confucianism became the social and political basis of the Joseon state. In Japan, Confucian thought first influenced the ethical standards of the samurai and their education. In Vietnam, Confucianism permeated governmental policies and its civil service. By way of these permutations, Confucius laid the foundation for the entire East Asian civilization. Central, harmonious social relationships and family values form the heart of Confucianism. The idea of jiao, filial piety, regards respect for parents and ancestors as the base of social order. Confucianism, however, inculcated obligations among families and communities for loyalty, respect, and righteous conduct. All of these ideas found their way into family organization, marriage, and social manners in East Asia. The conception of moral self-cultivation of Confucius influenced not only political life, but also personal habits and ethics. He promoted an agenda of Ren, suggesting that people practice kindness and empathy for others. The idea that ethical conduct begins with oneself and extends to family, community, and society is an enduring legacy. Confucius taught that the cultivation of virtue in oneself is a contribution toward greater social harmony. Yet, ever present in its legacy, Confucianism has endured critique and rebuff, especially when periods of social and political upheaval pass in their way. For example, the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, saw legalism, a tougher authoritarian outlook, drub Confucian thought with a view to extinguishing its flame in the short term. The Cultural Revolution saw Confucianism arranged as a symbol of feudalism and oppression in the 20th century. In times of modern criticism, Confucianism has perhaps tended toward considerations of rigid social hierarchies and inequality of genders. Yet following from that, and perhaps leaning in opposition to that notion, there have been scholars and practitioners who have attempted to reinterpret Confucianism in relation to modern issues such as human rights, democracy, and gender equality. There has been a distinguished revival of Confucianism in both China and globally in recent decades. Many see Confucius as having pertinent advice to give regarding ethics, leadership, and social responsibility in our present complex and interlinked world. Contemporary Confucian institutes are institutions that hold this vantage. Confucius gave encouragement for education, respect, and moral cultivation. This provides a more balanced path for aspiring individuals between meeting their needs and those of society. A symbol of wisdom, learning, and moral integrity, Confucius is commemorated with statues in schools, temples, and public areas. The teacher's birthday is celebrated in some countries as Teacher's Day. Works such as the Analects are widely studied to this very day by scholars and students alike, and are open for everyone interested in philosophy, ethics, and governance. Confucius lived during an age of chaos and fading moral standards when his teachings offered an encouraging view of human potential and social harmony. Intertwined exists in the endurance of his teachings for over 2,000 years and his insistence on personal virtue, ethical leadership, and respect for tradition. In these times of fast tempo and uncertainty, Confucius's thoughts call to the importance of character, learning, and bonds that uphold a society. And the legacy endures not simply by force of historical tradition, but because his wisdom addresses commonplace human issues that cut across time and space. Thank you so much for watching this detailed story of Confucius's life and legacy. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and educational content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let us know in the comments which part of Confucius's life or philosophy inspired you the most, or if you want us to cover other great historical figures. Your support means a lot and helps us bring you more quality content. Until next time, keep learning and stay inspired.